August 1979. In the pine silence of Northern California, a research station lost its radios, its clocks, and its echoes. The forest went mute, colors drained, and above the treetops a pale oval light hovered, erasing every trace of those who watched. Northern California, late August of 1979. The research station of the United States Forest Service stood on the margin of a protected reserve, surrounded by tall pine ridges and shadowed valleys. The buildings were modest, a collection of low wooden cabins and prefabricated structures erected on a flattened plateau near the tree line. A narrow dirt road connected the station to the nearest paved highway more than 20 miles away. During summer, the place was both remote and self-contained, relying on a shortwave radio tower and a diesel generator for communication and power. The personnel assigned to the station followed a strict routine. Their duties revolved around monitoring soil moisture, recording precipitation, and reporting fire hazards across the region. Each day began with measurements at dawn. When air was still cool and thin, fog lingered between the trees. Data sheets were filled with numbers that captured temperature variations, barometric pressure, and wind speed. By afternoon, when the sun bore down heavily on the dry forest floor, staff members retreated indoors to transcribe results and maintain the radio log. Evenings were usually quiet. The forest was alive with insect noise, the hum of cicadas, and the restless cries of birds returning to their roosts. The cycle of work gave the station a monotony that many of its workers came to accept. The isolation was broken only by the occasional dispatch vehicle delivering supplies from the nearest town. By mid-August of that year, the team had settled into the predictability of their assignment. Their journals and notebooks recorded nothing beyond the expected patterns of drought, humidity, and sporadic lightning storms over the distant ridges. On the 19th day of August, as the sun dropped behind the western peaks and the air began to cool, the staff prepared for another uneventful night. The time was just past 2100 hours when the first irregularities were noticed. The shortwave tower lost its signal with the nearest fire lookout. At first the interruption seemed minor, a fading transmission that could have been explained by atmospheric interference. Yet when portable field radios began to power down one after another, the disruption gained weight. Batteries that had been checked earlier that day were suddenly inert, as if drained of all charge. A technician stepped outside with a compass to verify orientation before attempting to reset the generator feed. The instrument spun without pause, its needle circling continuously rather than settling on magnetic north. The behavior was noted with confusion, but also with the detached discipline that field workers often carried. The reading was written down, though even the act of recording felt tenuous, as if the environment itself resisted preservation. The night deepened quickly. By 21:30, the familiar chorus of the forest had vanished. No insects sang, no owls called, no rustle came from the underbrush. The absence of sound was not a gradual fading, but a sudden subtraction, like a curtain pulled across the senses. Even the wind, which should have moved through the branches, seemed suspended. Staff standing outside the cabin became aware of an oppressive stillness. Their footsteps pressed against gravel but gave back no echo. Breathing seemed louder than it should have been, yet carried no resonance. Minutes passed under this silence, measured only by the mechanical ticking of a wall clock inside the main cabin. The contrast between the normal rhythm of time and the erasure of environmental sound created a disorienting sensation. Several members of the team wrote later that the air felt flattened, as if three-dimensional space had compressed into a muted surface. It was shortly after this that the light appeared. From beyond the northern ridge, a soft illumination rose, not sharp like a flare, not scattered like moonlight, but concentrated in a low oval. The glow expanded slowly until it hovered above the tree canopy. Its form was distinct, neither spherical nor angular, but elongated, with edges that seemed both defined and blurred, as if focus could not fully resolve it. The surface shimmered faintly, like molten metal cooling, though it reflected nothing around it. The pines below did not shine with its glow. Instead, the object carried light inward, as though it absorbed rather than emitted. Instruments inside the station were directed toward the phenomenon. A tape recorder connected to environmental sensors began spooling, yet when the tape was later reviewed, it revealed nothing. No fluctuations, no spikes, no anomaly beyond blank space. Photographic attempts fared no better. Frames developed later showed only featureless gradients, as though the emulsion had been exposed to emptiness. Observers noted physical sensations while the object remained. The air pressed heavily on the chest. Skin prickled as though in a static field. A metallic taste lingered in the mouth, unconnected to any identifiable source. The sense of time altered. Minutes felt stretched, though watches ticked steadily. The hovering light maintained its position for an indeterminate span, estimated at several minutes. It did not rotate or drift with wind. It remained locked above the ridge, utterly silent. Its presence redefined the surrounding forest, transforming the landscape into a void stripped of detail. When it departed, it did not accelerate or vanish in motion. It simply ceased. One moment the object existed, the next it was absent, leaving no trace in the sky. With its disappearance, a new silence settled, deeper and more complete than before. Equipment powered back without intervention, but gauges showed no memory of interruption. Radio static returned, yet without coherent signal. By midnight, the station had resumed a semblance of order, though the staff recognized that something had altered the environment in ways not captured by their instruments. Notes from that night describe a sense that the forest itself had been rewritten, that reality had thinned and admitted an intrusion beyond comprehension. The record of August 19th remains incomplete. Logs show gaps where text should have been. Several pages are blank, though marked with pressure indentations as if words were once inscribed and then erased. Soil samples collected that evening were later found sterile, devoid of the microflora typically abundant in the region. The first interference had occurred, not announced by sound or warning, but by subtraction, by the quiet removal of ordinary functions, leaving only the memory of a light above the trees and the void it carried with it. By the morning of August 20th, the research station had shifted from a place of quiet observation into the epicenter of a growing anomaly. The air felt denser, the light seemed thinner, and the most ordinary acts of daily life began to dissolve into a strangeness that resisted comprehension. What had started the previous night as silence had expanded into something more complete, more consuming. When the staff awoke, they found that sound no longer behaved as it should. Conversations carried only a fraction of their volume, as if the air itself absorbed each word before it could travel. Even when someone raised their voice, the result was a muted murmur that collapsed after only a few feet. Footsteps pressed into the gravel outside but produced no echo, not even the faint crunch that should have accompanied each stride. Inside the cabins, doors shut without a slam, chairs scraped across wooden floors without resonance. The absence of ordinary sound created a distortion of perception, leaving every individual uncertain of distance, depth, or their own physical presence. Breathing itself was altered. Inhaling and exhaling became foreign experiences, felt internally but never fully heard. The rhythm of lungs continued, yet detached from the environment. Some staff described the sensation later as though their bodies were sealed inside an invisible chamber, cut off from the exchange between self and world. The isolation this produced was profound. Even standing side by side, they felt separated, as if each person occupied a private vacuum. By midday, vision began to fail in ways that were subtle yet undeniable. Colors drained from the forest. The green of pine needles dulled to a pale grayish hue, grass lost its vitality, and the blue of the sky faded into a lifeless wash. The faces of the staff altered as well, distinct features flattened, edges softened, and individual differences blurred. Skin tones grew uniform, eyes seemed washed out, and hair lost definition. Looking into the face of a colleague produced a moment of hesitation, as if the mind struggled to anchor recognition to a dissolving surface. Equipment throughout the station became useless. Thermometers stuck at zero regardless of the actual heat of the day. Barometers froze in place, their needles unmoving despite fluctuations that should have been recorded. Anemometers failed to spin even when faint gusts brushed the treetops. The diesel generator continued to hum, but the dials connected to it displayed blank readings. Attempts to document these failures proved equally futile. Notebooks filled with notes the night before now held only faint indentations where pens had pressed. Fresh entries dissolved as they were made, ink vanished, letters blurred, entire lines collapsed into whiteness, as though the paper rejected inscription. This erasure extended to memory in disquieting ways. One technician raised his hands in front of his eyes and found them translucent. The outline remained visible, yet the sensation of flesh and muscle was absent. He could not feel the weight of his fingers, nor the pulse of blood beneath skin. Others reported similar distortions, the absence of warmth in their limbs, the fading of texture beneath their fingertips, the sense that their bodies were becoming porous, hollow, or transparent. By late afternoon, efforts were made to escape the station. Groups attempted to follow the dirt road southward, carrying compasses and marking trees along the way. At first, the journey appeared ordinary, the landscape consistent with maps and prior surveys. Yet after several hundred yards, the path folded back toward familiar ground. No matter the direction chosen, the staff returned inexorably to the perimeter of the station, as if distance had collapsed inward. Compasses spun in contradiction, pointing north and south simultaneously, their needles circling without rest. The forest itself became a closed loop. Landmarks repeated, the same bent pine tree appearing again, the same boulder with its lichen-covered face, the same hollow where roots clawed across a drainage ditch. Attempts to move beyond this enclosure left the staff exhausted, disoriented, and more deeply immersed in silence. Time seemed compressed, with walks lasting hours, yet depositing the wanderers back at their starting point with no memory of turning. Inside the station, the atmosphere thickened. Shadows grew soft-edged, outlines of objects bled into one another. A chair was no longer distinct from the floor it rested upon, walls merged into ceiling. The boundaries between materials weakened. Glass panes lost their transparency, becoming blank surfaces without reflection. Water drawn from taps carried no taste, as though stripped of mineral presence. Food supplies diminished in substance, bread felt insubstantial, fruit collapsed into textureless pulp. As evening approached, the zone appeared to pulse with its own logic. The silence deepened to a point where even thought seemed muffled. Attempts to recall events from earlier in the day faltered, memories dissolving into fragments. Journals that should have held testimony remained stubbornly empty, pages blank despite repeated effort. The world around the staff was no longer merely quiet. It was consuming. It absorbed sound, erased color, collapsed distance, and blurred identity. What had been a research station surrounded by forest now felt like a structure, floating in an indeterminate void, tethered not to Earth but to an absence that spread outward in every direction. By the close of August 20th, the anomaly had expanded fully, leaving the staff adrift in a zone where reality itself was stripped layer by layer until only the awareness of its removal remained. By the fourth day, which was August 23rd of 1979, the anomaly that had enveloped the research station no longer behaved as a disruption of the environment. It had become an active process of removal, a slow, deliberate erasure of signs, appearances, and boundaries. The staff had already endured silence, the collapse of sound, and the muting of color. Now they confronted the steady withdrawal of identity itself. The first to be noticed were the photographs. One of the staff had kept a small camera, a simple tool for documenting vegetation, wildlife, and seasonal changes. When the film was developed using the darkroom equipment kept in a storage shed, the prints revealed nothing but blank expanses. No blurred outlines, no distortions of exposure, only pure whiteness, sheets of light where forests, faces, and structures should have been. The absence was more disturbing than any distortion, for it suggested not failure of equipment, but failure of the world to imprint itself upon matter. Maps hung on the walls of the central cabin underwent a similar transformation. Boundaries faded first, then contour lines, then symbols marking roads and rivers. Within hours, each sheet resembled an untouched page, a void where cartography had once imposed order. Efforts to redraw the terrain were futile. Pens pressed against the surface left no ink behind, as though paper resisted the act of inscription. Even carved attempts with a knife failed, the scratches sealing over in moments, erasing the trace of the blade. The erasure extended to clothing. Shirts once colored in shades of green, blue, or brown dulled into uniform gray. Jackets lost their insignia, boots shed their scuffs. Soon garments looked interchangeable, stripped of texture and hue. The effect was not sudden but gradual, as if dye and thread relinquished their differences under pressure from an unseen solvent. Skin followed. The staff began to resemble one another, faces flattening into uniform masks. Freckles disappeared, wrinkles smoothed, scars dissolved. Even hair lost its tone, shifting toward a muted gray. Eyebrows thinned into near invisibility, eyes dulled, lips faded into pallor. By evening, it became difficult to distinguish one person from another. Recognition faltered. Names felt misapplied, for the bodies they had once belonged to no longer carried unique signatures. Time collapsed, internal clocks fractured. One person insisted an hour had passed since dawn, while another claimed it had been only minutes. Watches ticked, but the movement lost consistency, second hands stuttered, then drifted. Mechanical time fractured just as personal time did. Sleep cycles dissolved. When staff lay down, they entered not dreams but voids, intervals of absence from which they awoke without sense of duration. The nights produced no visions, only gaps that could not be filled by memory, identity fractured alongside chronology. Without features, without distinctions in clothing, without reliable records of time, the staff began to confuse one another. Names slipped. The concept of I and you thinned. Journals that attempted to capture the sensation filled with repeated phrases before fading entirely. The most common of those phrases, recovered later in fragments, was a single expression. The signs are disappearing. The environment mirrored these changes. Grass along the perimeter of the station lost its green entirely, collapsing into a monochrome haze. Pine needles dulled until they blended with trunks. Stones bled into soil. Sky and earth grew closer in shade until horizon itself weakened, no longer a boundary between above and below. As twilight approached on that fourth day, the object returned. It did not descend dramatically, nor did it streak across the sky. It appeared as if called into being, low above the treetops. Oval, steady, neither glowing nor reflecting, but emanating a uniform light without source. The air thickened with its arrival, compressing into a pressure that bent perception. Breathing became laborious. Movement grew slow, as if each gesture carried through a medium denser than water. The staff felt themselves dissolving. Not physically, not immediately, but perceptually. They sensed that the object was not directed toward them, but toward the framework that made them perceivable. Features, identities, boundaries were being erased not by destruction but by negation. To exist became harder. To remain distinct became effortful. When the object hovered above the clearing, instruments failed entirely. Needles froze, pages whitened. Logs disappeared. The anomaly extended through space, through thought, through record. Every attempt to preserve the moment collapsed into nothingness. Only the awareness of disappearance persisted. No one could determine how long the object remained. Time within the zone had already dissolved. It could have been minutes or hours. When it left, it did so without acceleration or departure. The light ceased, the form ceased, and only the density of silence remained. By the end of August 23rd, there was little left that could be called sign or record. People, objects, and the land itself were reduced to faint outlines against a vast neutrality. The stuff continued to exist, but in ways that no longer carried difference. They were present, yet interchangeable. They moved, yet without trace, and so the fourth day closed with nothing recorded except fragments of fading perception, and one phrase repeated in notebooks, later found erased but partially recoverable under magnification. The phrase was simple, stark, and without context. The signs are disappearing. By the sixth day, which was August 25th of 1979, the research station in Northern California had ceased to resemble a functioning outpost. What remained was a cluster of cabins half dissolved into silence, inhabited by staff whose differences had eroded into near uniformity. Yet a few still clung to the act of documentation, as if the insistence on record could preserve them against the slow annihilation. Notebooks recovered much later contained fragments, nothing more than scattered lines etched faintly into paper that itself resisted inscription. Words thinned, faded, and sometimes slid across the page like water that refused to settle. But the fragments that survived told of their struggle. One note read that the silence was thicker than air, compressing into lungs with each attempt at breath. Another described that colors were no longer present, that objects existed in degrees of gray, stripped of spectrum. A third claimed simply that we are the same, written without punctuation, the sentence repeated 3 times across a page before vanishing into white. The act of writing itself had become unreliable. Pens left traces for seconds before letters faded into invisibility. Pencils produced marks that disintegrated into smudges. Typewritten attempts produced empty pages, the ribbon striking but leaving nothing. Some staff turned to scratching words into wooden tables or door frames, but the grooves sealed over within hours, as if the material itself refused permanence. Cameras failed in similar ways. Surveillance units mounted along the cabins produced only gray static, their reels filled with drifting bands of monochrome. Portable still cameras developed images that at best revealed streaks of pale ash where people had stood. Attempts to capture the luminous object on film resulted in emptiness, as though the lenses themselves refused to acknowledge its presence. One of the senior foresters, a man who had served in the station for over a decade, persisted longest with his journal. His handwriting, steady but faint, lasted longer than most others. In the margins of his notebook, he wrote a line that would later be noted by archivists as the final coherent observation from the station. It stated, "If this is an observation, then it does not require us as individuals, it erases the differences." After that entry, the notebook ended mid-sentence, the ink trailing into whiteness. No further words remained. By the 8th day, which was August 27th, the environment within the zone had grown featureless. Soil hardened into uniform surfaces, water reflected no sky, and trees lost the variance of trunk and branch. People moved like repetitions of one outline. Their gestures were identical, their footsteps muted, their shadows absent. The distinction between object and witness blurred until each seemed to pass through the other without resistance. On the 9th day, August 30th, the luminous object returned. It did not appear at a distance but pressed close, hovering above the cabins of the station itself. Its radiance was not blinding but consuming, a steady saturation that dissolved architecture into glow. Walls disappeared into its surface, roofs folded into light, and instruments vanished as though absorbed. The staff did not scatter, nor did they approach. They simply stood in the haze, their forms dimming as if context itself no longer applied to them. That night, the silence extended far beyond the perimeter of the forest. Across the state, operators monitoring radio transmissions reported a phenomenon that none could account for. Entire bands of the spectrum went dead, not with static or interference, but with complete absence. The usual background hiss, the cosmic and atmospheric murmur that never ceased, was gone. Receivers recorded only pure emptiness, a silence that persisted for hours. In military stations, commercial towers, and amateur setups, the same report emerged. It was as if the air itself refused to vibrate. No messages came from the research station after that night. No voices, no coded bursts, no telemetry. Equipment at nearby fire towers noted only the same blankness. Attempts to call into the zone yielded nothing but the quiet that had already consumed the interior. Later, when search parties would attempt to recover what remained, they would find the buildings intact yet strangely muted, with walls pale and uniform, surfaces stripped of texture, and notebooks that dissolved into blank paper at the touch. But in those final days, the last fixations were nothing more than fragments scratched against a vanishing medium, words like silence thicker than air, colors gone, we are the same. The luminous object had not destroyed, but absorbed. It had left behind no wreckage, only absence. On the 9th night, the silence across the state ended abruptly at dawn, replaced by the ordinary hiss of background radiation. But at the station, silence endured. It would be 10 days before anyone else set foot within the zone. By then, there was nothing left to observe, only an afterimage of presence erased. On the morning of August 29, 1979, a combined party of Forest Service personnel and officers of the National Guard was dispatched into the Northern Californian Reserve. The last transmission from the research station had occurred days earlier. Afterward, the radio spectrum had gone silent. The decision to send a search team was not announced publicly. It was presented in internal memos as a routine welfare check, but those who traveled into the mountains knew they were entering a place already rumored to be marked by disappearance. The convoy consisted of 2 military transport trucks, 1 jeep, and a Forest Service utility vehicle. The route wound through narrow roads lined with pine, the trees close and oppressive. The silence along the approach was noted within the first hours. Birdsong that normally threaded through the canopy was absent. No insects droned, no branches shifted. Even the vehicles seemed subdued, their engines muffled, as if sound itself was being absorbed by the terrain. By midday, the group reached the clearing where the research station stood. At first glance, the cabins and outbuildings appeared intact, unscathed by weather or damage. Windows were closed, doors secured, vehicles parked in their usual places. It looked less like a site abandoned and more like a place paused. Yet the stillness was unnatural. Dust did not drift, air did not stir. Watches worn by the searchers reported inconsistent times, hands stalling before jumping forward in irregular bursts. The team entered the main cabin first. Inside, the signs of occupation were immediate. Cups of coffee sat on tables, still stained dark along the porcelain but lacking scent. Plates held crumbs that had no texture when touched, dissolving into powder. Notebooks lay open across desks, but the pages were pale, the lines vanished, the writing surfaces blank. Even reports still in typewriters bore only empty sheets, as if the ribbon had never struck, though its inked band remained intact. Chairs were pushed back as if people had just risen moments before. Beds in the quarters were unmade, coats hung from hooks near the doors. Yet there were no signs of struggle, no footprints leading outward, no evidence of deliberate evacuation. The impression was of a place interrupted in mid-motion, stripped of the people who had animated it. The storage building revealed a more unsettling absence. Rows of glass jars, each labeled with printed tags for soil and vegetation samples, filled the shelves, but inside every jar was nothing. No soil, no roots, no fragments of leaves, only a faint haze, as though air itself had been sealed within. The tags carried dates, the last recorded as August 24th, but the handwriting was faint and incomplete. Some labels had dissolved into smudges, leaving no record of the sample that should have been preserved. In the communications room, the instruments were arranged as expected, but dials were frozen at fixed positions. The central clock on the wall displayed 2:41, its second hand suspended in place. Portable watches compared against it gave no consensus, some running fast, others stalled entirely. The logbooks, which should have contained nightly radio transmissions, contained only white pages. Tapes stacked beside the machines rattled lightly when moved, but when unspooled showed no magnetic imprint, no trace of sound. The searchers spread outward into the compound. The generator was still fueled, yet its motor resisted ignition, not through mechanical fault but through refusal to catch spark. Fuel lanterns lit briefly, then extinguished, leaving only faint trails of heat. In the kitchen, water from a pump filled pitchers but carried no taste, no mineral presence. It was as though substance itself had been erased. Beyond the buildings, the forest was equally altered. The wind did not move the upper branches. Needles lay in thick carpets, but when disturbed returned to perfect stillness. Footsteps of the search team left no echo. One soldier wrote in his notes that the silence was absolute except for the sound of his own pulse in his ears. Another wrote that he felt as though he was walking inside a photograph where nothing could change. No human remains were discovered. No documents of identity, no personal letters, no official archives. Filing cabinets stood open and empty. The dark room contained racks of developing paper, but each sheet was featureless white. Rolls of undeveloped film stored in boxes had degraded into transparency. Not a single image survived, though tags on boxes listed dates stretching back months. The officers made systematic sweeps across the surrounding grounds. Every path curved back toward the cabins. Compasses spun irregularly, sometimes holding steady, sometimes rotating without cause. Attempts to pace outward along the trails ended in disorientation, the group circling back to where they had begun without recognizing how. The forest gave no depth. Beyond 100 meters, the trees blurred into sameness, each trunk repeating like a pattern. Reports filed in the field described not only absence, but compression. One observer noted that air felt heavy, as if silence itself carried weight. Another wrote that he could hear only himself, his boots, his breathing, but never the others, even when they stood nearby. When they attempted to call across the clearing, their voices diminished after only a few feet, swallowed by the stillness. By late afternoon, the team withdrew, leaving monitoring devices behind to record in their absence. Yet within hours, those devices failed. The recordings retrieved later contained only faint scratches of static, punctuated by intervals of complete blankness. The absence of environmental noise was more complete than any wilderness silence. The official report described the site as devoid of human presence, material records, and biological samples. The phrase used repeatedly in the margins was only silence. The absence was catalogued, photographed, measured, but never explained. The final note in the field commander's log stated, "Time inside is uncertain. All evidence erased, no staff recovered." The search concluded with no recovery of personnel, no documentation of departure, and no trace of resistance. The station remained intact but hollow, a shell stripped of its history. The glass jars, the frozen clocks, the empty notebooks, all stood as artifacts of something that had not destroyed but absorbed. For those who entered the site, the memory remained unsettling. They had walked through structures filled with the residue of daily life, yet stripped of all markers of individuality. They had heard only themselves, as though each was sealed in solitude despite standing among others. The impression lingered long after they left the clearing. The report was filed, stamped, and sealed. To the public, the event was never mentioned. To the men who searched, it became an unspoken memory of a place where silence was the only inhabitant. The official report was filed on September 5th of 1979, 1 week after the search team's return. It was concise to the point of dismissal. The document consisted of fewer than 2 pages. The typed lines stated only that the research station had been abandoned under unknown circumstances, that no signs of violence were discovered, that personnel were not recovered, that all archival and material records were missing, and that no anomalous phenomena were confirmed. The closing sentence declared the site cleared of further concern. No signatures of individual officers were attached. Only the emblem of the agency appeared, stamped in black ink, privately among the notebooks that circulated within the search party and the marginal notes later discovered in personal files. Another account survived. Those pages were less ordered, written by men who had not been able to align their experiences with the words permitted in the official summary. They spoke of pressure that hung in the air like unseen weight, of silence that was thicker than atmosphere, and of boundaries that dissolved even as they tried to observe them. One entry described how the forest appeared blurred at its edges. Pines that should have stood as distinct silhouettes against the sky instead merged together into a smear of gray-green, as though the outlines themselves were eroded. Another note recounted how the grass beneath their boots seemed colorless, indistinguishable from the soil, as if the ground was refusing to differentiate between one surface and another. 2 of the men recorded physical symptoms. They described a nausea that came not from motion but from proximity, a sickness that rose in waves whenever they approached the main building of the compound. Their sense of balance faltered, and the horizon tilted without movement. One soldier wrote that he had closed his eyes and still felt the station swaying, as if the structure were adrift in water, though it stood anchored on earth. These fragments never entered the archives. They remained in personal journals, later resurfacing in fragments when families donated belongings to regional repositories. Even in those cases, names were often redacted, as though the identity of the witnesses mattered less than the impression left behind. By the time September ended, the station itself was already vanishing from the record. Maps of the reserve produced for public use no longer showed its marker. Requests for coordinates through official channels were returned with statements that no such facility had operated in that sector. Personnel who had once served at the station were reassigned without mention of prior duty. Their service files carried gaps or vague notations that referred only to field placement. Among local residents, however, a quieter memory persisted. Farmers on the outskirts of the forest remarked that in late August of 1979 the nights had fallen strangely empty. The chorus of crickets had failed, the flutter of moths against porch lamps had ceased, and owls that normally hunted the ridges did not call. For several nights in succession, the county had lain under a dome of quiet that was unlike weather or season. People described it later as if the land had drawn in breath and refused to release it. As years passed, the forest reclaimed the clearing. The wooden walls collapsed first, softened by moisture and rot. Roofs buckled inward, beams fell, and the outline of the cabins crumbled. No plaques marked the location, no boundary signs remained. To a casual hiker, the place became nothing more than scattered foundations hidden beneath brambles and moss, yet the ground bore its own refusal to heal. Grass grew reluctantly across the soil where the station had stood. Saplings that sprouted along the perimeter reached a stunted height before withering. The vegetation that thrived elsewhere in the reserve failed to take root within the clearing, leaving bare patches of earth that weather could not disguise. Tourists who wandered through the area sometimes remarked upon a strangeness they could not define. They spoke of a hush that pressed upon their ears, not simply the absence of sound, but a density of stillness. Conversations faltered, footsteps seemed swallowed, and even the rustle of clothing diminished. Some described the sensation as walking into a room filled with unseen fog, a substance that was not visible, but that clung to every movement and breath. Occasionally, hikers reported that cameras behaved oddly in the clearing. Photographs developed into frames bleached of contrast. The trees appeared pale, the soil uniform, the sky blank. Others noted that their watches slowed, minutes stretching without cause, only to correct themselves once they left the site. None of these accounts reached official channels, for by then the station had ceased to exist in any acknowledged capacity. In regional folklore, the place became a point of quiet unease. Stories circulated in fragments of a summer when the forest stopped speaking, of a government camp that erased itself, of people who worked in the woods and never returned. Elders repeated the tale with restraint, never elaborating but never dismissing. They spoke of silence that was not natural, silence that remained even after decades. Researchers who attempted to trace the incident through state archives in the 1980s and 1990s found little more than gaps. Files bore dates but no content, numbers but no text. Inquiries ended in corridors of absence, the paperwork echoing the very emptiness of the site. What remained was only the memory of erasure. By the early 2000s, the station existed only as rumor and ruin. Yet those who stood in its clearing felt the residue of something unfinished. They described the air as reluctant to carry sound, the ground as reluctant to bear growth, and the forest as reluctant to remember. It was as if the erasure that had consumed the staff and their work had not ended but continued to seep through time, thinning reality where the buildings once stood. The report filed in 1979 had closed the case with words that concealed rather than explained. It had stated there were no anomalies. But in the decades that followed, the land itself remained the record, a page that refused to fade, a silence that could not be archived away. And those who stepped into that silence carried it with them, an impression of a place where sound, color, and identity had once been removed, leaving only the trace of what had been erased.